Hello and welcome to one of the lectures for the Stanford Responsible Conduct of Research course. My name is Holly Tabor and I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Medicine and Associate Professor of the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics and Clinical Ethics in Education. Today's lecture will be on the topic of authorship. So I'm going to start by talking about why authorship matters. And these points may be obvious to many, if not most, of the people who are participating in the RCR course and watching these videos, but they're still really important to discuss and go over. The first reason why authorship matters is that it confers credit and has important academic, social, and financial implications. I think everybody who's involved in biomedical research understands that authorship is one of the sort of main currencies of the realm, so to speak, and that authorship is important for recognition, for promotion, for getting grants and fellowships, for other kinds of important institutional recognition. And so for that reason, I think everyone understands that authorship is considered very important. But authorship also implies responsibility and accountability for published work. And this is very important because it's important for protecting the public reputation of science and the trust in biomedical science as an institution, and also for ensuring that the work that gets published in scientific journals and medical journals is actually as accurate as possible, and that the individuals who produced it can vouch for that work and can answer to any inquiries that come up when that work comes out into the broader world. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be referencing the ICMJE guidelines. The ICMJE is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and they have come up with a list of guidelines about authorship and about publication, which are available on their website. We have a link to that website at the end of this PowerPoint, and we'll also post an article about that on the website. The important thing about the ICMJE is that most biomedical research journals, medical journals, have signed on to the ICMJE guidelines. And so they're important to be familiar with, even though, in fact, many people in the field are not familiar with them. So according to the ICMJE, authorship is based on 4 criteria, and it's actually all 4 of these criteria, not just one, not just a subset of these criteria. The first criteria is substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data for the work. And that's perhaps the most obvious criteria for authorship that most of us are familiar with. The second criteria is drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content. The third criteria is final approval of the version to be published. And the fourth criteria is agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. And so again, it's not just one of these criteria, it's all of these criteria together that are important for authorship. The ICMJE also talks about the role of the corresponding author for publications. And the corresponding author takes primary responsibility for communication with the journal during the manuscript submission, peer review, and publication process, and typically ensures that all the journal's administrative requirements are met. And these requirements can include providing details of authorship, for example, who did what is required by many journals, ethics or IRB approval, clinical trial registration documentation, documentation of other kinds of data sharing that are now increasingly required by journals, and gathering conflict of interest forms and statements from all the authors and ensuring they are complete and get to the journal. The corresponding author also should be available to respond to editorial queries in a timely way during the publication process and review process, and should be available after publication to respond to critiques of the work and cooperate with any requests from the journal for data or additional information should these questions arise after publication. Increasingly, a lot of work that's published comes out of large multi-author groups, and these kinds of multi-author groups present challenges sometimes to authorship and how authorship should be represented. And there are a variety of ways to do this, and the ICMJE has some rather detailed recommendations about this, which I won't go over here, but are available on their website. But just briefly, the group should ideally decide who will be an author before the work is started and confirm who is an author before submitting the manuscript for publication. And all members of the group named as authors should meet all 4 criteria for authorship. The ICMJE resources also talk about ways to acknowledge important contributions that do not meet the criteria for authorship for large multi-author groups, and I'd recommend you look at their resources if that's something that's interesting and important to you. So what are some signs of authorship problems? And these are signs that you might see from articles that are actually published. And these are, again, signs that are shared by the ICMJE. One sign is that the corresponding author seems unable to respond to comments, whether they're reviewers' comments or comments from the public after, or the audience that's reading an article after it's been published. Again, these are signs primarily for reviewers. Changes are made by somebody not on the author list that you can see and track changes. Someone's an impossibly prolific author. A particular important role is missing from a list of contributors. For example, is there not a statistician if there were statistical analyses done that's listed? An unfeasibly long or short author list suggests potential problems with authorship. And when there's an industry-funded study that has no authors from the sponsor company, which might be legitimate, but it might not be. And then on the other hand, when the authors seem to all come from an industry-funded study and their roles are not clearly described. So these are signs of authorship problems primarily for reviewers and for journal editors, but they're also important to know as potential authors and writers of publications that are being submitted. So how can you reduce the incidence of authorship problems? And I think it's safe to say that it's impossible to do biomedical research without coming across an authorship problem or challenge or dispute, at least indirectly, during your time that you work in this field. One is to encourage a culture of ethical authorship. I think this is really important from every potential participant in biomedical research at every stage of training and of their career. It's really important to start discussing authorship when you plan your research and to decide authorship before you write each article. And this will be a theme that comes up in the rest of the presentation, that really you can't talk early enough and clearly enough and frequently enough about authorship. And if you don't do that, that is often when and how problems can occur. So how can you handle authorship disputes? And these points come verbatim from a very nice article from the Nature website in 2012 called Authorship Who's On First, which we have a link to at the end of this PowerPoint and also we'll have on the website. So the first is to make sure that you choose your collaborators carefully and make them people with whom you can work well. And this seems like an obvious point, but it's actually sort of an explicit question that you should ask yourself when you actually form collaborations whenever possible. As I said earlier, discuss authorship early and keep doing so as often as a project evolves, and put it in writing whenever possible, confirming conversations and emails. When there are disputes, first try to talk it out amicably and understand the other person's point of view. For example, try to work out how the idea first came about. And if you must approach your supervisor about an authorship decision that you don't like, keep the tone inquisitive, not accusatory. For example, explain that you want to understand how authorship was decided. If a contributor's authorship is in question, it can help to consider what the paper would have looked like without their efforts and whether someone else could have made the same contribution. And this can help determine whether that person merits authorship, being listed as an author. This is really important and unfortunately not done as often as one would hope. Familiarize yourself with your institution or the journal's authorship guidelines, as well as the ones we've discussed from the ICMJE. Far too frequently, researchers at every level are not familiar with their institutions or the journals or the ICJME guidelines. And you can use those to help to explain people why you have concerns about someone being included or excluded from authorship, or potentially about your role as an author. It's really important to be prepared to compromise and share credit, sometimes even if you may not feel like that's always the absolute best option for you. Compromise and sharing credit is really important to both working out these authorship disputes and to actually sort of supporting the collaborative and trustworthy nature of science. But if you can't agree among yourselves, then engage a supervisor, trusted colleagues, or an ombudsman to investigate the matter and make a recommendation. So in summary, authorship involves 4 key criteria, and it's all of these criteria: a significant contribution to key stages of the work, drafting and revising the work for important intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. It's important to choose your collaborators wisely and talk early about authorship and corresponding responsibilities. Try to discuss disputes openly, patiently, and be willing to compromise. And engage supervisors or trusted mentors when other attempts to negotiate a compromise have failed. And finally, I just want to reference, as we are in some of the other talks for the RCR course, some of the research ethics resources at Stanford, and one of them is the Benchside Ethics Consultation Service, and this is the website where you can learn more about that. While this probably shouldn't be your first line of reference in an authorship dispute or with concerns about authorship, the authorship is definitely one of the questions that sometimes comes up and has consultations come to this service. So this is a resource that is available to you. And here's a link, a list of the articles that we referenced in the creation of this talk. We'll also put these articles on the RCR website so you can go back and refer to them. Thank you very much.